I go for refuge until I'm enlightened to the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Sangha. Through the merits of giving and the other perfections, may I become a Buddha to benefit all sentient beings. I go for refuge until I'm enlightened to the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Sangha. Through the merits of giving and the other perfections, may I become a Buddha to benefit all sentient beings. I go for refuge until I'm enlightened to the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Sangha. Through the merits of giving and the other perfections, may I become a Buddha to benefit all sentient beings. And then the text, for those who are following in the actual pages, we're on page 288. And so we're kind of in the midst of a 15, remember last time we said this, a 15, we didn't finish the 15 parts, right? There's a 15-part answer Lama Tsongkhapa is giving to an objection, right? And I just want to remind people, the objection was that some people misunderstood, he's going to raise various objections here, or misunderstandings, but that he's kind of helping address, right? Tsongkhapa is helping address different ways people misunderstand Madhyamaka thought. And this one was, that some people, there were a few different, in brief, it was refuting, that some people misunderstood, because Chandrakirti said, is such a nature, meaning the ultimate nature, unperceivable? Therefore, how do they perceive it? And the answer, Chandrakirti, that is indeed true. However, it is said they perceive it by means of non-perception. Right? And some people took that to mean that there's no such thing as perceiving emptiness, the ultimate nature of phenomena. And so Lama Tsongkhapa is sort of clarifying that that's not the correct meaning of this, right? And also that quote also is not some sort of it doesn't mean there's no such thing as perceiving emptiness, because there is a perception of emptiness. And it's also doesn't mean, it's not like some kind of, sort of paradox that just sort of leaves you in that you can't know anything or something like that. And so he talks about, and then actually he has this other quote, seeing without seeing is the most excellent seeing, which I think is a beautiful quote actually. And then he points out, right, that the actual meaning of those quotes is that once you find the object of negation, right, which means that truly that you find your own projection, or we call it sometimes, in this text I like it, they call it superimposing, right? You find how you yourself superimpose a truly existent self, right, on yourself, actually, right? And then when you analyze it, you discover that truly existent or inherently existent or independent self doesn't exist at all, right? That one doesn't. So not seeing that is the supreme seeing of emptiness, right? Because emptiness is the lack of existence of that thing. It doesn't mean there's no self at all, right? It means that particular inherently existent self, or self from its own side, doesn't exist. But the merely dependently arisen, that self conventionally does exist. And so you get the point. So now he's going through various points, details, clarifying that issue. So we're up to the sixth of those, the eighth rather of those various points. So I'll pick up there. I'll read the heading. It says, in the perspective of an uncontaminated meditative equipoise, object and subject are not posited as separate. And you get the point here. He keeps doing, Lama Tsongkhapa throughout this section, not just the short section, but the section on the two truths, keeps doing this, which is, I think, very important, actually, is he keeps raising this question of, from which perspective? Does that make sense? Because because sometimes if you're looking at something from the perspective of the ultimate truth, then that is the meditative equipoise. The actual ultimate truth, right, is that which is perceived by that ultimate, uncontaminated meditative equipoise, right, that directly perceives emptiness in a non-dualistic way. Does that make sense? Now, there are other times where, for example, then there's conventional truth mind, right? Which is not in such a meditative equipoise. And that mind sees, bodies and chairs and tables. And every now and then, that ordinary mind, right, that ordinary conventional truth mind, thinks about the ultimate, right? But I just want to remind you all, because we said this last time, when a conventional truth mind is thinking about the ultimate, it's thinking about it dualistically, right? And I'm even doing this gesture on purpose. Does that make sense? That's over there, in the sense that whereas from the ultimate truth mind's perspective, it's non-dualistic. Does that make sense? I'm just reminding you. We talked about that last time. So here he's addressing that further. So he says, furthermore, it says in the explanation, so it's like the auto commentary of Chandrakirti's commentary on the Middle Way. I think it supplements the Middle Way, really. But anyway, it says, quote, therefore it is posited from imputation that suchness is realized. But actually, it is not that something is known by something else, because neither the knower nor the object of knowledge have arisen. Now here you can see, I just want to point out, right, if, like you could actually kind of sympathize, I want to sympathize with those who misunderstood for a second, right? Like, if you weren't, Lama Tsongkhapa spent, as we talked about last time, spent decades, right, studying, contemplating, meditating on this topic, had conversations with great teachers, and then had visionary conversations with Manjushri, the Buddha of wisdom. Anyway, so he's offering us here this incredibly clear, and that they say that's one of Lama Tsongkhapa's great deeds, one of his particularly gifts or something like that, was that His Holiness Dalai Lama says that, other people said that too, but His Holiness Dalai Lama once said, there are writers, Lama Tsongkhapa wrote a great deal, like they say, 18 volumes or something of text, but and a volume is not like one book. It's like a volume is like a big, thick Tibetan, one of those wrapped things that can have a number of books in them. But he pointed out, he said, there are actually Tibetan authors who have written more than Tsongkhapa, more extensively, written longer treatises and encyclopedias and things like that. And then he said, Lama Tsongkhapa, one of Lama Tsongkhapa's very unique gifts, though, that His Holiness, and other people have said this too, that he was the best at in Tibetan history, was raising the most difficult points, like the points that are hardest to understand, and making them very clear. That was his one of his, everybody has different gifts. That was his unique, one of his, there are a number of them, but that was one of his unique gifts. There are certain points in sutra like this, and then in tantra, like the illusory body, they say, that are very difficult to understand, and those he lays out in this extremely clear way that people won't misunderstand. But so that's what so I'm just pointing that out. So, but to sympathize, right? If you read just this quote and you don't have Tsongkhapa to guide you, you can see how something, right? It says, therefore it is posited from imputation that suchness is realized. But actually it is not that something is known by something else, because neither the knower nor the object of knowledge has arisen. You could think, well, okay, so nobody realizes anything, right? You could actually read that and think that that's what it means, right? It wouldn't be that hard to interpret that passage in that way and be a mistake. Right? And so here is Tsongkhapa's kindness. He says, the first part means that to posit the realization of suchness, taking the exalted wisdom and suchness separately as object and subject, is to posit it merely in the perspective of a conventional consciousness, rather than in the perspective of that exalted wisdom. Quote, the knower has not arisen means that with respect to its object, which is not inherently arisen, it is like water poured into water. So here he's making it very clear, isn't he? So what he's saying is, actually it's quite interesting, right? If you're looking at the ultimate truth mind, right? So somebody realizes emptiness directly, an Arya Bodhisattva, for example, right? Has realized emptiness directly. And then if we talk about that person, right? We can say, because we're in a conventional truth state, right? So we can say, oh, their mind realized the ultimate truth, right? Emptiness. And this is what he's saying, right? So from a conventional perspective, one can talk that way, right? And that's fine. There's nothing wrong with talking that way conventionally. But we shouldn't confuse, right, the point that from their own perspective, in that state, there is no experience of subject and object, right? There's no sense of I here realizing emptiness there. Their experience is like water poured into water, right? And so he's saying, so you have to understand which perspective you're talking from. Does that make sense? And that's why, like at other points in Chandrakirti's text, he'll say, you know, something like, Bodhisattvas make great effort to realize emptiness directly, right? Something of that sort, right? Because they do. But there he's talking from a conventional perspective, right? Then when he's talking from the ultimate perspective, he says, neither the perceiver nor the perceived have arisen, right? But what he's talking about there, he's using language to communicate something about the experience of that person. That when they're in that state, there is no experience of an arisen object and subject, right? It's completely a non-dualistic experience for that person in that state while they're in that state. And that's why he says, has not arisen inherently like water poured into water, right? That they're inseparable from the perspective of that kind of experience of actual ultimate truth. Does that make sense? Okay, I want to make sure it's clear. Yeah.
Is this where the tawa comes in, like the view?
Say how, in what way?
The view, meaning, I know Khenso Rinpoche had discussion on this when we were doing the Chandrakirti last year. It's the view that defines.
Yeah, the reason I'm pausing is sometimes by the view they mean like emptiness itself. Like is your, you know, like when they talk about like view, meditation, and action, for example, then the view is emptiness. But so I can't remember when he was using it. There are different ways people use that term.
Right.
So sometimes they'll use it as referring just to emptiness itself, and then sometimes, so you could say, well, we're going to study the view now, and that would just mean we're going to study emptiness. But here, yeah, I guess it's a similar thing, isn't it? So we're talking about from which perspective.
Which
Yeah,
perspective.
yeah. So it could be. So that word, I guess I'm just saying that word is used in different ways. So I can't remember which. Khenso Rinpoche may have used it in different ways at different
I
times.
think we were discussing about the view, saying a subject can have a view, and then object itself has a view too, right? Like you're viewing something, you're viewing emptiness.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and we'll get more into that in this text in a few pages too. So yeah. So then the next item, number 9, the header says, suchness is actualized by way of stopping the movement of conceptual thought. So now it says, as for the statement, and then it's a quote, right? Since mind and mental factors do not operate with respect to suchness, the object of exalted wisdom is actualized only by the body. And now again, this is a bit of a difficult passage if you don't have somebody to explain it. I will say that it's just true. This is where, I mentioned this I think last time, right? That Dalai Lama had suggested studying the works of Tsongkhapa first and then reading the great Indian classics. And it's really helpful in the sense that if you try reading Nagarjuna without having studied commentaries, it's very difficult actually. Very, very difficult to understand what he's talking about. Once you read the commentaries and then you read, it's actually quite funny, I think. I sometimes think that. It's like, I think I once said that before, but it's almost like, this is just my personal experience, like that if I hear a commentary by one of my teachers, then I can understand Tsongkhapa. If I read Tsongkhapa, then I can understand like Chandrakirti's commentary to Nagarjuna. If I can understand Chandrakirti's commentary to Nagarjuna, then I can maybe understand something of what Nagarjuna is saying. And it's like, that one almost has to go step by step like that. Maybe some people are sharper, you know, they can just read like Nagarjuna directly. I mean, there are people like that, I think, but Tsongkhapa even wasn't one of them. You know, even Tsongkhapa himself had to study Buddhapalita's and Chandrakirti's commentaries to understand Nagarjuna. So I think they say it's like more degenerate times, like so that at the time of Nagarjuna there were people who could just read Nagarjuna and understand his intent. I'm not sure if Tsongkhapa couldn't, then who can? I'm not sure.
His Holiness talks about like an old man trying to chew his food without.
Yeah. That's a traditional Tibetan saying, isn't it? But okay, so now Tsongkhapa is going to explain that passage. So it says, the object to be actualized is suchness, right, meaning emptiness. The subject, exalted wisdom, is that which actualizes it. And the complete enjoyment body is the agent of actualization. That is the knower. The manner in which it is thereby actualized is by way of stopping conceptual activity of minds and mental factors, as explained earlier. From the explanation in the commentary, it is understood that the body, by means of which suchness is actualized, is in the nature of peace, because it is free of minds and mental factors. So what this is saying, first of all, to explain what Tsongkhapa, to explain what Tsongkhapa is explaining a little further. What this particular passage he's quoting is referring to the experience of a Buddha, is one point. So it's not this particular passage is not even referring to the experience of, for example, a bodhisattva, who's actualizing emptiness. This passage is specifically referring to the experience of a Buddha. And that's why when it says, what is the body that actualizes the complete enjoyment body, that's the Sambhogakaya of a Buddha. So it's referring to a particular body. The Buddha, the Buddha's body, sometimes there are different ways of categorizing. Most of you know this, right? Sometimes it categorizes two, like the Rupakaya, meaning the form body, and the mental body or wisdom body. So then you can subdivide. It's not different, but you can subdivide those into three. So then it's the form, we call it the Nirmanakaya, meaning the emanation body, the Sambhogakaya, this one, the enjoyment body, and the Dharmakaya, meaning the wisdom body. Dharmakaya. Dharmakaya would be like truth body, actually, better. Right? Dharma is the truth there. And then you can subdivide it into 4 if you want, or 5, or more. You can keep subdividing. And those aren't different presentations. They're not disagreeing with each other. It's just like you can get to more detail, if that makes sense. But here, when he says complete enjoyment body, that means the body of a Buddha. Does that make sense? The complete enjoyment body of a Buddha. So what it's saying here is, who actualizes this experience that he's talking about? A Buddha does. Right? And then when it says, and this is important because he says, like described earlier, where he says, no mind and mental factors, that means no conceptual minds, no conceptual mental factors. Right? It doesn't mean no mind at all or no mental factors at all. It means no conceptuality. And what that's getting at is that a Buddha no longer has... So what Chandrakirti is actually saying is not nobody realizes anything. What he's saying is Buddhas, with their complete enjoyment body, know things, particularly in this case, ultimate truth, directly. By way of direct perception without any conceptual overlay, or conceptuality, or dualism. Does that make sense? So what he's actually saying here is, for a Buddha, everything is perceived directly. There is no dualistic mind. There are no conceptual mental factors. It's all non-conceptual. So that's what that passage is actually saying. It's not saying a Buddha doesn't know anything. Buddha's omniscient. Buddha knows everything according to Buddhism. So that would be like an untenable or ridiculous position. What it's actually saying is Buddhas don't have conceptuality. Then the next is, he says what I just said. If a Buddha did not perceive the aggregates and the like, his exalted knowledge of the varieties would be deprecated. So it says, if a Buddha did not perceive the aggregates and the like, his exalted knowledge of the varieties as well as the varieties of all objects would be deprecated, because the two exist and not to be known by a Buddha. For them to exist and not be known by a Buddha are contradictory. So here what he's saying is, from that, Mahayana Buddhism asserts this idea, right, that a Buddha is omniscient. And actually a very important point, just to remind people, right, this is Mahayana Buddhist position. Buddhas are not omnipotent. Right? Omnipotent means all-powerful. Right? So I just want to remind people of that. So in that sense, because otherwise it would be like asserting that Buddhas are like some kind of divine creator, which they're not. And Buddhas didn't make you, right? And they can't force you to do anything, actually. It's like so. But so I mean, because we use these words, right? So because omnipotent means all powerful, right? So Buddhas are not all powerful. But according to Mahayana Buddhism, Buddhas are all knowing, which means they know all things that exist. If something doesn't exist, then they know it doesn't exist. But they don't, they don't know non-existent things. They know existent things. And so here, what it's saying is, so a Buddha sees ultimate truth. We just said that, right? Now he's addressing the point. Buddhas also see conventional truth. Does that make sense? Well, he says the aggregates. That's like the form, feelings, right? So Buddhas, and actually remember that. What are the aggregates, right? Form, feeling, discrimination, compositional factors, and consciousness. That's usually the way one of the translations. Right. So what it's saying is, Buddha knows each sentient being's aggregates, right? And environment as an object of knowledge. Does that make sense? So that's what he's saying here. And he's saying, so if you think, oh, if somebody were to assert, which some people, like when somebody says, oh, because he's still refuting this idea, right, that there's nothing to be known, that nobody knows anything, or that Buddhas don't know anything. And he's saying not only do Buddhas see all the conventional, not only do Buddhas actually see the ultimate truth, emptiness, they also directly, without conceptuality, see all conventional objects. So now he's addressing this issue, he's raising that point.
Dr.
Yep.
I always thought about this one. So, if you're omniscient as a Buddha, how are you not omnipotent? I mean, you know everything. I mean, if you will, probably the karma comes into picture. So, if you want to help me, or if I want to help you, and I know everything that I can do in my power to help you, I mean, I'm omnipotent too. Do I use it? Do I not use it as a separate thing?
I guess here's the point, like, because part of it, what you're getting at in a way, the implication of what you're saying is that, first of all, that we all, like, let's say this right. Like, so a Buddha is omniscient, for example. So let's say, you're angry at your neighbor, for example, fake story here, right? So if you're angry, right, like the Buddha knows you're angry, right? And the Buddha knows that your anger will cause suffering. And actually it's an interesting point, because they say the Buddhas are good at timing. One of the skills of a Buddha is time. So also, like, one thing the Buddha knows is, like, well, if I tell Rajiv his anger, like in the moment when you're angry at your neighbor, the Buddha knows, well, if I were to suddenly appear to Rajiv and say, Rajiv, your anger is going to cause you suffering, then he'll just get more angry. So now is not the time to try to teach Rajiv the faults of anger, for example. If they know that, if the Buddha knows it. So my point is that, like, the Buddha has limited influence. And in a sense, the Buddha's omniscience makes him a skillful teacher, because he knows how to teach sentient beings skillfully, but he can't stop you from getting angry. And if you said, I'm going to go kill my neighbor, which you wouldn't do, but, like, the Buddha doesn't have the power to somehow, like, put you in a force field and, like, put you some other place or something. Like, the Buddha can explain to you the faults of that, for example, of that decision, but that's, like, so the Buddha doesn't have ultimate power over you, for example, right? Does that make sense? That's what it's addressing.
So it almost means that he cannot control your karma. Your karma, you have to go through it. But after the fact, maybe he can help you. But after the fact. That's what you're saying.
Yeah, I guess part of the issue is that, actually, it's quite interesting, isn't it? Because how does the Buddha help sentient beings, right? And, that's where the Buddha often says, right? Like, I can't, there's a famous quote, I forget the exact wording, right? Where he says, I can't transfer my realizations to you by touching you. I can't wash away your negative deeds by pouring water on you, right? I can only teach you the truth. And so, I guess part of it, actually, if you just pause and think about it, it's quite true, isn't it? Like, I don't know, before the fact, after the fact, like, we all have if you think about just reality, if you check, we can each check for ourselves, right? Like you can actually look at yourself and realize, like, I have a pretty limited capacity, actually, for hearing the truth. You know what I mean? Like, and even if somebody tells me the truth, how many times have you had that experience, like, where, like, actually, well, first of all, of yourself, right, where it's like, wow, somebody told me that, like,
10 years ago.
Yeah, how many times? But I didn't quite hear it. And then you can also see it with other people. Like, I don't know if I said that here. Sometimes when I have this funny experience. Remember the movie The Matrix? There's a scene, and I always think of this, I often have thought of the scene over the years. There's a scene in The Matrix where he goes to the Oracle, and the Oracle tells him, like, this and this and this are going to happen. And he starts freaking out, right? And she says, don't worry, have a cookie. By the time you leave here, you'll forget that I even said any of that. And the reason I often think of that is sometimes I work as a psychologist, and there are often times where I realize, like, I'm saying something and the person's hearing it, and I'm like, by the time they get to their car, they'll forget.
Oh.
I know, like, I absolutely know, like, by the time they get to the car, they'll forget I said this, but maybe someday it'll come back, and so it's worth saying because it's true. But I know, like, the person's not yet quite ready, but maybe they're almost ready, so it's worth saying. And I guess my point is not to put, I'm the same. Like, I know sometimes I'm there with Lama Tsongkhapa and he's explaining something and I'm starting to get it and I know, oh wow, by the time he finishes talking, I'll lose this. Like, I'm just barely able to kind of, through his power, understand something, but I know, oh, by the time he finishes and I go back to my room, you know, I'll look at my notes or something and I'll think and I won't quite get this. But if I keep trying, maybe I'll get back eventually, you know, slowly. And so we have this limited capacity. And so I guess that's the point, isn't it? So the Buddha, you know, and that's why even like, there's all the, I was thinking about it the other day because I was reading the biography of Tsongkhapa even. And in one way, Tsongkhapa was already a Buddha, but in another, he was, I think, enacting the deeds of a non-Buddha, that's what they say it. But it was like that even with the Manjushri. Like, he's asking Manjushri all these questions about emptiness, and there comes this point where Manjushri says, I've told you enough. Go practice. Go do retreat. You won't realize what I've said until you've done enough practice yourself, you know. And then he goes off and does retreat, and then he realizes, you know. Yeah, so it's quite tricky, isn't it? So yeah, so to go back to your point though, yeah, so the Buddha can't control your karma. The Buddha can tell you how to influence and change your karma over time, but he can't do it for you, and if you decide not to listen to him, you know, there's a famous passage even in the life of Shakyamuni Buddha, where like, he knew that this other group was going to come, he had already left home and was a Buddha, you know, but he was from the Shakya clan, right? He was supposed to be king of the Shakyas, or his father had been king of the Shakyas. And he knew that this other group was going to come and attack and kill many of the Shakyas, like his family. And he realized he couldn't stop it. Because it was the karma. You know, the Shakyas had done violence, and then violence was to be done back. And then, you know, if he had gone and said to the rival army, they just would have said, you know, oh sure, you're from their side. We don't want to listen to you. You know, that he wasn't capable of stopping that, because that's the Buddha's lack of omnipotence, right? He can't you know, all he can do is explain the truth. So that's the point here, is that he knows the truth and can explain the truth, but he can't force anybody else to accept that or to change their behavior unless they choose to. So that's the lack of omnipotence, though. Does that make sense?
Yeah. So, in that sense, when we talk about guru blessings and we talk about other blessings, does that exist or does that not exist?
Yeah, one thing I really like when they talk about blessings of the guru or blessings of the Buddha is what they say, actually. It's quite an interesting point. Like, for one point they say is the Buddha's always sending blessings. You know, that's what a Buddha does. In other words, they radiate compassion and so on. So one, they make various points. One is that, but you have to, like, so one analogy, this is the analogy I often thought of, like they say, you know, if they give this analogy of like, you know, like a hook sent down, like almost like a crane. I think we use that in Tibet, obviously they didn't have cranes, but like if something sent a crane with a hook at the bottom down, no matter how many times you send that down, if what was at the bottom of a well was a basketball, it'll never pick up the basketball. Like, a hook will never lift a basketball, right? It'll just bounce off it every time. You know, even if you got it under it, it won't lift it up. But they say, but if what's at the bottom of the well has a hook as well, then they can connect and lift up. And that's the metaphor they use. They say, you know, you have to have a relationship, in other words, like to the Buddha, of faith or of devotion or of something like that, you know, and then there's a relational quality where you can receive the blessings. And so, and I guess they say that to the extent to it, actually they often say that, they say the extent to which a person receives the blessings is not dependent upon the Buddha, it's mainly dependent upon how much you yourself have faith and are open to that. And so, again, it's because it's dependent on the arisen. It's not like something independent. And so it depends upon your mind, your karma, your relationship, And the Buddha can't force anybody to receive a blessing, actually. Like, you know, I often think of that like with the story of Asanga, right? When he was in retreat for 12 years trying to see Maitreya. And then, he finally gave up, and then he saw a dog, right? And then he like tried to save the dog from the maggots that were infesting it, and suddenly the dog appeared as Maitreya, right? And what I like about that story in part is that Asanga got upset, actually, right? And he said, "Where were you?" Like, he said, 12 years. Come on. I was in a strict retreat for 12 years. Where were? And Maitreya's answer, which gets right at your point, is Maitreya said, "I was there the whole time. You couldn't see me." And then he said, "After 12 years, you would have purified your karma enough that you could perceive me as a dog." And he said, "It was only your compassion and love that purified you further, and now you can see me as Maitreya." But Maitreya's point was, I was there the whole time. It's quite interesting, isn't it? Like, but even Asanga couldn't receive the blessings until he had to have faith, but also he had to have enough, what's the word, purification to be able to receive the blessings of Maitreya. Okay, so now Tsongkhapa is going to go on a little more. Oh, sorry, go ahead.
It's almost as though our concept of control doesn't exist.
Say what you mean.
Well, in Western society, we think of controlling other people, power, right? That's a key point of our existence. That concept doesn't seem to exist in Buddhism, of one person or even the Buddha controlling other people. It's not a concept that exists.
I think I see your point. I mean,
because that also implies duality.
Well, no, I'll make one point too. I'll just elaborate on that. I think it's an interesting thing to think about. Is one point, and just yesterday I was talking to a group of Dharma Buddhist friends about this on a personal level, like, because I was sort of reflecting as we were talking about how, like, our society actually, I think in one way you're right about this, like, our society sort of has unrealistic, we grow up with unrealistic expectations around that issue, and so sometimes you can see that actually where people, even like I was thinking about this yesterday, where people, we sometimes, either if you're kind of a power hungry person, then you think you should be able to achieve some kind of big control. If you want to help others, then oftentimes people beat themselves up. Oh, I couldn't, why did I fail to make everything better for this person? As if we have the control to do that, which is also kind of, again, like a little ridiculous actually. And what I was kind of thinking deeply about this, because I was like, on the one hand, like, of course Buddhist texts recognize that, like, they have many examples of, like, a bad king who throws, an innocent person in jail. And but actually even in the Sutra of Golden Light, there's a passage like that, where there's a bodhisattva who does some kind of magical thing, and then the king gets upset because people are upset about it or whatever, and the king throws the guy in jail. And then when the king lets the bodhisattva out of jail, the bodhisattva makes this point. He says, because of some past karma, I got thrown in jail. Right? He doesn't say, you threw me in jail, what's wrong with you, you stupid king, or something. Right? He says, because of my past karma, I temporarily got thrown in jail. Now that karma's purified and I'm out of jail. Like, he doesn't give his power away to the king. He recognizes, I create the cause, and now that cause has changed, and now I have a different experience. So it really does get at this, I mean, it's getting, that passage is getting at something similar to what you're saying, I think. And that, like, there's those beautiful passages in Nagarjuna's letter to a king, right? Where he kind of says, like, he's pointing out to this king, well, if you serve the Dharma as a king, great. If you serve sentient beings with kindness, great. But he makes this kind of point, right, where he says, like, basically what he's saying, I mean, he doesn't use these words, but essentially what he's saying is, king, you're not even in control of yourself. You're not in control of the fact that you were born as a king. You're not in control of when you're going to die. You're not in control of where you're going to go after you die. You're not really in control of what people think of you, of whether your subjects like you or don't like you. And temporarily you can make their lives better or worse through conditions. But even then he doesn't say this, but even then the king's controlled by their own mental afflictions. So it's minute. And I guess I'll share one more personal thought that was related to what you were saying. I was thinking about this, like, even His Holiness the Dalai Lama, right? Because, like, I was thinking of His Holiness, of other teachers too, but different great Buddhist teachers. And, you know, like, the Dalai Lama is not omnipotent, right? That's why, if he were, Tibet would already be free, right, from Chinese rule, and people wouldn't be being tortured there. You know, all one can do is act wisely, you know, but we don't have control over what other people's karma is, or even what other people will do we? And I was thinking that even like, because I was thinking that even with like, well, even the Buddha himself, for example, right? There's a famous story of Devadatta, his cousin, who didn't like him and didn't listen to anything he said. You know, his whole life got to put the Buddha down. And the Buddha didn't care, but you know, that's the point, isn't it? I guess it's like, yeah, you can't, you know, so, and so I guess I'm just pointing out, because sometimes culturally we think we should be able to stop those things. So I think it's actually quite useful. I think actually growing up in a culture, I just wonder that sometimes, where the ideal, if the culture's ideal is some kind of omnipotent being, maybe there's some kind of sense that we should be more omnipotent. I don't know if that's true or not. But, yeah, Buddhism doesn't have any idea that you should be able to control everything.
No. But on a personal level, you can concentrate on the negative or you can concentrate on the positive, in that you can work on stopping your negative behavior, which is, even if you can't do the positive behavior, that's way better than, doing nothing is better than the negative behavior, and then you can work on doing positive things from that point. So I think that's good to be brought out also, because we can get pretty negative about, that. We can't control this or that, why try? But we can't control everything, or we can try to control everything happening right here.
In ourselves.
In ourselves.
And that's the job, that's our job, right? Our job actually is to control our own body first, that's easier, and then our own mind, which is harder. Right? And there's a famous quote, I think it's from the Dhammapada, I'm not going to get the exact wording right, but, you know, where the Buddha says, you know, like, he gives two different analogies. He says carpenters form wood, you know, or bend wood or something. You know, like a, whatever, like a, you know, a farrier or something like that, like forms metal. And he says, but good people form themselves. Like, that's our job, actually. That's our job, is what to control, is our own mind, ultimately. And our own behavior. You know, so I agree with you 100%. That's where we should focus, because that's what we actually have control over. And the more we work at that, the better control we get. Like, whereas if you work at controlling others, actually, Gyurme Khenso Rinpoche often says that. He says, if you want to control other people, focus on developing love inside yourself. Not because that's going to manipulate anybody, actually, but because if you're loving, that will have a positive, then your influence on others will at least be positive. If you're not loving, whatever you're trying to control is going to make things worse. And so he's saying, if you want to control other people, work on your own mind to become more loving. That's the extent to which you can have influence, essentially.
It all starts within you.
It all starts within you, whatever influence you're going to have on the world. And we can have a huge impact on the world, you know, but that comes from, actually, that really comes mostly from our mind, right? Like, you know, if you cultivate hatred, then you'll have a strong negative influence eventually. You know, if you cultivate love, you'll have a stronger positive influence. But that's just because we're interdependent with others. It's not that we can control others, if that makes sense. It's because we're relational. And so, you know, if you can cause a lot of suffering if you have enough hatred, you know, and you can cause a lot of happiness if you have enough love, but ultimately it's your own mind that matters in terms of our influence on others. That's true.
So Dr. Lauren, of the three levels of suffering, the first and the second can be controlled with mind. It's the pervasive suffering that actually you cannot control.
Well, you can control that eventually, not immediately.
Not immediately.
In other words, if you work hard enough and you achieve the realization of emptiness and you achieve enlightenment, then you've controlled that one. Right? You've subdued it, and you're no longer a subject to it. That's what they say, like the Buddha conquered Mara. That's the real meaning of conquering Mara, actually, isn't it? Is that the Buddha, as we're describing, realized the ultimate truth so completely that he destroyed ignorance in his own mind, right, which is internal, and then, in that sense, Mara is a metaphor for ignorance. That's one of the four Maras, the Mara of ignorance. So now, Tsongkhapa continues with this point about, he's calling it the exalted knower of the varieties. So this want to be clear, where he says the exalted knower of the varieties, that's the aspect of a Buddha's mind that knows all phenomena, that's omniscient. Does that make sense? So it's a phrase here, right? Exalted knower of all of the varieties. That means the aspect of a Buddha's mind that's his omniscience or her omniscience. So it says, this is point 11, the exalted knower of all aspects must know them, since they appear to that knower of varieties. Hence there are two types of appearing objects. And so this next section is, the next two sections kind of go together, and they're a little philosophical again. So he says here, therefore the varieties of objects must appear to the knower of varieties. And since it is not knowledge without aspects, as far as this system is concerned, the aspects appear to it. So I just want to pause there. What would be knowledge without aspects? He's saying it's not the knowledge without aspects. So what's a knowledge without aspects?
Like impermanence, suffering.
No, in this context, like knowledge without aspect, just I'll answer the question. It's emptiness. What he's saying is because emptiness is just emptiness. There's no color, there's no shape, there are no like varieties. In other words, there could be the emptiness of various objects, but they all have the same taste, is one way they put it. And there's no aspect to that. Like, I remember that story. One time I was with somebody and they said, I was with a geshe, I think I told this story before. I was sitting with a geshe and a student, and the student said, I can't remember which color it was. I think he said, I think I saw emptiness, Geshe-la. And the geshe just looked at him, and he said, it was yellow. And the geshe just kind of sat kind of very still, and then he turned and said, hey Lauren, what do you think of that? And I was like, it's not yellow. Emptiness has no aspect. It has no color. It has no shape, right? If you say, I saw emptiness, it's round. You didn't see emptiness, right? I saw emptiness and it's brilliant, it's light, no, emptiness has no, it's not dark, it's not light, it's not purple, it's not blue, it's not round, it's not square, right? It has no aspect in that sense. Does that make sense? Because remember, it's a non-affirming negation, right? You find the object to be refuted, which is inherent existence, and then you recognize that doesn't exist, right? So it's like, that's why, remember earlier Tsongkhapa said, the only metaphor I can give, essentially, for emptiness is space. It's not space, but it's like space. In the sense, what's space? It's a negation of obstruction. Tsongkhapa said that a few pages ago, right? He said like this is obstructing, right? But in space, there's no obstruction, right? And he says, so that's the only metaphor I can give for what the experience of emptiness is like. It's something that isn't, you perceive it by not perceiving, right? Like we said, seeing by not seeing, right? You see space by not seeing stuff, and you see emptiness by not seeing the object of negation. Does that make sense? So in that sense, it's without aspects. Does that make sense? So he's saying the seeing of emptiness is a seeing without aspects, right? It is seeing, but it's seeing something that has no aspects in the sense of color, shape, and so on. Here he's saying, but the knower, the omniscient mind aspect of the Buddha does see aspects, right? The Buddha sees, your sorrow and your joy. Sees that when you're young, the Buddha knows you're young. When you're old, the Buddha knows you're old. When you're tall, the Buddha knows you're tall. When you're short, the Buddha... So that's aspects. Does that make sense? He also knows that you're only short in relation to somebody else, and you're only tall in relation to somebody else. And, it's all relational. It's not ultimately existent, right? It's not, there's tallness and shortness are not inherently existent, right? But conventionally they exist relative to a context. Does that make sense? And the Buddha knows all of that. So those things have aspects. Does that make sense? There's color, shape, labels.
So it almost looks like it's dependent origination.
Yeah.
That's what you're talking about.
That's right.
Then if he understands the labels, then when he tries to communicate with you, isn't the conceptual mind operating, or what's operating for the Buddha?
Yeah, I asked Ken Rimshe that, and he said, I thought it was very interesting. He said, the Buddha uses words non-conceptually.
Oh.
And I said that, and I said, well, when the Buddha has an intention to benefit others, and he said the Buddha does have the intention to benefit others, is a non-conceptual intention to benefit others. That was his answer.
Okay.
Because I wanted the same thing.
Yeah.
And he said the Buddha's use of words is a non-conceptual use of words. So that's
Thank you.
yeah. But because I wondered, yeah. So anyway, so he says, right. So he's saying here, the aspects appear to it. Does that make sense? So in other words, the knower of varieties, an omniscient mind has to have aspects appearing to it, right? It knows that's a chair, you know, and that's a, what is that, table? I don't know. I'm not even sure what it is. What do you call those little things? Table? I guess so. It's like a little tiny table.
Without legs, it's a tray.
Then it'd be a tray. Yeah, right, because is it a tray or a table? That was I couldn't think of the word. So if you fold the legs, and then it's a tray.
Yeah.
So he says, yet the varieties of appearing objects are both that which is unpolluted by the predispositions of ignorance, such as, okay, so now, this we need to explain. So he's saying, so the Buddha sees aspects, right? That was clear so far, right? Now he's going to point out that the Buddha he's getting into this whole thing about perspective in a second. From whose perspective, right? So he's saying, then when the Buddha sees aspects, he says now there are, he's going to mention two general categories of aspects that the Buddha sees, pure and impure. What does that mean, right? Pure aspects are aspects of, for example, the form bodies and pure lands of Buddhas themselves, right? So like part of the Buddha's omniscience is, let's say you're Shakyamuni Buddha. You know that Amitabha Buddha, who's red and lives in the Western paradise, exists. Does that make sense? You know that Akshobhya Buddha, or that Tara, green Tara, is green, and she lives in, I guess, Potala Pure Land. And you know that, you know, Yamantaka exists, and he's blue, and so on. So the Buddha sees, on the one hand, the Buddha, if the Buddha is omniscient, the Buddha knows all phenomena. Does that make sense? So here he's pointing out there are two types of phenomena that a Buddha know. You could categorize it this way. One is pure phenomena. So pure, and he says, what does pure mean? Pure means unpolluted by the predispositions of ignorance. And he gives the examples, such as the marks, major and minor marks of a Buddha. So what he's saying there is, those things, right, like Amitabha Buddha's pure red body and his pure land of the Western paradise, whatever, Sukhavati, the land of joy. That was not created by ignorance, he's saying, right? That was created by wisdom and compassion. Whereas he's already a Buddha, so he doesn't have, Amitabha's a Buddha, so he has no ignorance. And he has no mental afflictions. His body and his pure land were created as a compassionate manifestation to benefit others. And the Buddha sees those phenomena. So far, that's all he said. Now he's going to go on. And the Buddha also sees that which is polluted by the predispositions of ignorance, such as impure, inanimate and animate world. So here he's saying, what is that? That's us, right? The Buddha also sees us, right? And we're not pure in that sense, right? Our bodies and minds are created by ignorance and mental afflictions. Does that make sense? That's what he's saying here. And he's saying, so the Buddha sees pure phenomena, meaning the manifestations of Buddhas, and the Buddha also sees impure phenomena, which are us, you know, human beings and cats and dogs and so on, and our environments, such as we see them. That's one way of categorizing all the different, what do we say, varieties, right? There are all different varieties that one could see, and that's one way of categorizing. There are pure varieties and impure varieties.
So is the phenomenon impure, or is it our perception, whichever, of that phenomenon that's impure?
I think he's going to partly address that, so tell me if I didn't answer it, or tell me if Tsongkhapa didn't answer it when we get through that, and then if we didn't, we'll say more. Because he says, as for the first of these, meaning the pure first, right? He's saying, so the first of these, meaning pure phenomena, it would be meaningless if they came to an end at the Buddha level, right? In other words, pure phenomena, meaning the forms of a Buddha, don't end at the level of Buddhahood, they actually begin at the level of Buddhahood, and they are manifestations of that state. Does that make sense? So he's saying, so those are manifestations that continue for a Buddha. The Buddha himself or herself manifests such bodies, right? All kinds of varieties to benefit others. Then he's saying, Whereas the latter, meaning that which is produced by, the impure, that which is produced by ignorance and mental afflictions, come to an end at that level because their causes have come to an end. So you get what I'm saying, what he's saying there. So in other words, Buddhas don't manifest impure bodies, because impure bodies, and he just said, the definition of that is that which comes from ignorance and mental afflictions. The Buddha has eliminated ignorance and mental afflictions, so of course the Buddha wouldn't manifest something that is a result of ignorance and mental afflictions, because if you don't have the cause, the result doesn't come about. Does that make sense up to that point? We're not yet at your question, but that's the next paragraph. Now he says, how the manner in which they appear to an exalted knower of all aspects that realizes the varieties differs from the manner in which they appear to other persons. So now he's saying, the mode of appearance is as follows. When a Buddha's major and minor marks appear to, now, and here this is getting back to the perspective thing, right? So he's saying, so Buddha's major and minor marks, those are like the aspects of the form of a Buddha, right? Like the top knot, you can see the Shakyamuni Buddha here, right? The long earlobes and things like that. There are many different aspects. The Buddha has like wheels on their, like we have lines on our hand. The Buddha has lines on his hand too, but they say they're in the form of a Dharma wheel, and on his feet too, naturally, like from childhood, they're born that way. So they have like, they have an unusual looking body. It's said to be quite beautiful. But what he's saying here is, so now he's raising this issue of whose perspective, but I think it's starting to get at your point. So, but it's a long paragraph. So he says, when a Buddha's major and minor marks appear to a person who has not abandoned ignorance, they are not established by way of their own character, but they still appear to be. So in other words, it's quite interesting, isn't it? He's saying the form body of a Buddha, right, is not, how does he put it? Established by way of its own character. It's not inherently existent. Nothing is, right? And the Buddha who's appearing knows that they're not inherently existent. But if you or I, if an ordinary person looks at a Buddha, they perceive them as if they're inherently existent. Does that make sense? And so it's quite interesting, right? So, so he says, the reason for this is not that those objects arise due to the predispositions of ignorance, right? So the Buddha's form body didn't come from ignorance. Rather, they appear like that due to the subject's pollution by predispositions of ignorance. This is not because they appear to that subject merely from the perspective of appearing that way to other persons, but because they appear that way from its own perspective. So what he's saying here, right, is when you look at a Buddha, when I look at a Buddha, right, like the Buddha's body came from wisdom. But when I look at a Buddha, I see the Buddha from my perspective, which is ignorance, grasping at inherent existence, right? And so I see the Buddha in that way. The Buddha from their own side didn't arise from ignorance, but I can't help but see them from a perspective of ignorance because I see everything from a perspective of grasping. Does that make sense up to that point? And so he's saying, if the Buddha looks at themselves, they don't see themselves that way, right? From a perspective of ignorance, grasping at an inherently existent Buddha. But when an ordinary person looks at a Buddha, they do see the Buddha that way. And now, anyway, so I don't want to go make it more complicated. Does that far make sense so far? What he's saying?
So when a Buddha looks at himself and
he sees emptiness, and he also sees and he also sees his own color, shape, whatever, whatever his appearance is, and he sees that as not inherently existent, though. So he doesn't see that as if it were not empty. So he sees emptiness, and he also sees the dependent arising, you could say. Now he says, forms, sounds, and the like, objects that are not established by way of their own character, but still appear that way to someone who has not abandoned ignorance, appear to a Buddha's exalted wisdom, knowing the varieties, only by means of their appearance to persons with the pollution of ignorance. So I think here he's getting at a little bit at your question, I think.
It's an implication.
By implication, yeah, that's right. So what he's saying here, though, is quite interesting, isn't it? Is he saying, like, so when the Buddha's own body, we said already, right, arises due to wisdom, not due to ignorance. And the Buddha sees that body, right, but doesn't see it as related to ignorance. But he's saying, how about, like, so if a Buddha's, like, seeing the form of a ordinary person, right? Let's say even a person who's angry or something, right? First of all, the Buddha knows that person's angry, right? And then so they see their mental state, and they also see their body, right? Like, and so he's raising an interesting point. He's saying, but that body arose due to ignorance, right? And so how does he phrase it? I'm going to go back. Appear to a Buddha's exalted wisdom, knowing the varieties, only by means of their appearance to persons with the pollution of ignorance. So what he's saying is, in a way, like this, like, does the Buddha see those things as inherently existent? No. Right? But does the Buddha know that you see them that way? Yes. Right? And so the Buddha only, what's that, you say this right? Like, the Buddha knows, the Buddha sees those things. The Buddha, I'm trying to say it the right way. I don't use his exact phrasing because I don't want to say it in a way that's slightly misleading. Forms, sounds, and like objects that are not established by way of their own character, but still appear that way to someone who has not abandoned ignorance, appear to a Buddha's exalted wisdom, knowing the varieties, only by means of their appearance to persons with the pollution of ignorance. So that's the correct way to say it, right? So you see his point there, right? And it's actually quite interesting, right? Because, like, I just want to pause for a moment and reflect on that together, right? Like, so, like, if you're angry at somebody, right, and you think they're terrible, the Buddha knows that you're angry at them and think they're terrible. Does that make sense? And then at the same time, let's say that person's spouse thinks they're wonderful. Maybe. I don't know. But, if that's the mood the person's in, right? Or let's say their child, right? The child looks up to that person and thinks they're the most wonderful person in the world, right? Well, the Buddha knows that child's perspective. They look at this person and think they're the most wonderful person in the world, right? And then maybe, whatever, the person views themselves in a certain way. And the Buddha knows how that person views themselves in that moment, right? And actually, it's an interesting point. Does the Buddha grasp at any of those perspectives as ultimately true? No. Right? The Buddha just knows all the different ways that people experience things. That's my point, right? You know, and when the Buddha sees Fairfax County, right? That's where county we're in, right? Like, actually, it's quite interesting, isn't it? The Buddha sees, I don't know how many millions of people are in Fairfax County right now, right? And then there are all the animals, whatever, and other creatures, right? Like, so the Buddha sees how each being experiences Fairfax County, right? But does the Buddha have their own, like, opinion about Fairfax County? Or something, their own independent perception, let's put it that way. Their own perception of Fairfax County independent of everybody else's perception of Fairfax County. No. They just see this is an impure place created by the karma of all these beings who are here, and some of them love it, and some of them hate it, and some of them think it's wonderful, and some of them think it's filthy, and some of them think it's too hot, and some think it's too cold, or whatever.
You use the term impure place. Why would he, doesn't follow?
Yeah, actually, well, because the issue would be, it is, right, in other words, from the perspective of all those beings, it's an impure place.
All right, that'll go.
Yeah.
From our perspective.
And those beings, our perception of this place is created by our karma, and the Buddha sees that, and sees that and that's what it means by impure place, right? That it's created by our karma and mental afflictions.
But this place has the ability to, we have the ability in this place to become more better, even Buddhas in this place. So, in that sense, the word impure bothers me.
Well, I'll give what, actually, I'm just getting at your,
So you're right, I
Point.
agree with the idea, it's perspective.
it's from a perspective always. And I'll just share one reflection on that, like just what you're saying. I remember I wasn't there, somebody told me this story, but I can't remember who it was even. Somebody was at Kopan Monastery with, they were, I guess walking or standing, I don't know which, with Lama Tsongkhapa. And now, for the person who was telling me the story, Kopan's a wonderful place, it's a monastery and all that, but it's an impure place. They were an ordinary person. So from their perspective, it's an impure place in the sense that, like, they're worried about getting dysentery or whatever, getting diarrhea from eating the wrong food because it's Nepal and they're in a Westerner and they're not used to those things, whatever, like all that, right? So I guess my point is, from their perspective, it was an impure place. And then Lama Tsongkhapa pointed to Geshe Lama Kunchok, who's since passed away, but was a great yogi. And he said, oh, right this moment, right now, he's in Vajrayogini's Pure Land. And the person looked and thought, he looks like an old Tibetan guy, essentially walking across a grass or something, or a field, or whatever it was, walking across dirt or something. And Lama Tsongkhapa said, oh, from his perspective, he's in Vajrayogini's Pure Land. That's his experience, is he's in Vajrayogini's Pure Land. Right, so, so again, it's getting this issue. From the perspective of the person listening to Lama Tsongkhapa, they were looking at a place, and it was an impure place because it was a product, their experience of it was a product with their own mental afflictions and karma. From Geshe Lama Kunchok's perspective, it was a pure land, because he didn't have mental afflictions and karma anymore, apparently. And I guess, and if he, I don't know if he was or not, but if Geshe Lama Kunchok was a Buddha and he looked at that Western person who was standing there, then he would have known from their perspective it was an impure place, right? And they were worried about getting sick or whatever. Well, I'm just giving you some example, but you get my point. I think that gets at it depends on whose perspective you're looking at whatever the thing or place is from, which is kind of related to what Tsongkhapa was saying, although it's not the exact one.
How is it not dualistic though, if they are seeing us as not inherently existent, but they understand we're seeing ourselves as inherently existent, then isn't there a dualism in that?
He's actually going to get at that, I think, in a minute.
Oh, okay.
So, see, again, I'm saying
Okay,
as
I'll
to Paul.
wait.
See if it answers or not. I'm not sure if it will or not, but let's try. We'll see. Let me know. Because now he says, so about ordinary objects, right? Or impure beings and places. He says, they do not appear from a Buddha's own perspective independently of their appearing that way to others. Therefore, a Buddha knows forms and the like, which are not inherently established, but still appear to be, yet it is from the perspective of their appearing that way to the ignorant. Independently of their appearing that way to those persons, from a Buddha's own perspective, he would not know them in the manner of their appearing in that way. Hence, there is no sense that he is deceived by appearances, because they do not appear from the pollution existing within the exalted, from pollution existing within the exalted wisdom, but due to the essential point that the exalted wisdom necessarily knows all objects of knowledge. That being so, all things appear to be selfless, not inherently existent entities from the perspective of an exalted knower of the varieties, whereby they appear as illusion-like falsities. They do not appear as truths. When they appear to that exalted wisdom, in terms of their appearance to the ignorant, they merely arise as that which appears true to other persons. This is not yet getting at your question. I think it's in the next paragraph or two. So it's coming up soon anyway. But it actually comes up at the bottom of this page, which we should get to. But one is, I think that, again, I think it was pretty clear what he was saying there. And sort of pausing and think, like, I don't want to sort of get ahead and say things he's about to say, that Tsongkhapa's about to say, but, oh, maybe I'll just say this. I wrote down a note. Like, so, earlier when we were talking about conventional truths, right, in the section, when Tsongkhapa was talking about conventional truths in that section, he pointed out that there are two ways of talking. Early on, he said it was getting at what point you were just making. He said there are two ways of talking about conventional truths. One was truth as a truth for a concealer, or truth that conceals, right? That was for ordinary person, right, where something appears to be inherently existent object, right, and what it's concealing is that it's not, is its emptiness, right? Its emptiness is concealed. But then he said there's another way to talk about conventional truths, which is, I forget what exact phrase used, but essentially it's mere dependent arisings, right? Mere appearances, mere things that merely arise due to dependent conditions. And one has to talk, actually, now you can see from that earlier, right, now we can reflect back on that earlier section, and we can realize this is what he's talking about, right? Like, that for ordinary people, conventional truths do conceal something else, their emptiness. But for a Buddha, they don't conceal, actually, right? Because the Buddha doesn't see them as inherently existent from his own side. So for a Buddha, you could say they're what? Mere conventionalities, or mere dependent arisings. And they exist as dependent arisings. And the Buddha knows but the Buddha doesn't, from his own side, or her own side, see them as inherently existent, right? So they don't conceal anything. They're not concealers in that sense. Does that make sense? In this case, conventional truths are not concealing. They're not truths for a concealer or concealing truths or something. They're, that's one point. They're mere dependent arisings. And the Buddha sees that they conceal something for you. But that's a dependent really arisen, that's a mere dependent arising, right? And the Buddha, that's not deceptive from a Buddha's perspective. And he uses this word illusion, like, right? And I want to just remind everybody that of one metaphor that's often used, that was used in this book too, I think, which is, they sometimes say, like, they use the example of a magician who casts a spell and people see an illusion, right? It's an often used one, right? And they actually I'm just reminding everybody, there are three people usually, three kinds of people in that story, right? One is the audience. That's ignorant people like us, me, whatever. Like, right, that's where, so you see this illusory elephant and it charges at you and you're scared, right? Like, oh no, I'm gonna get trampled, right? And that's the person for whom things appear to be inherently existent, and they believe in that appearance. Does that make sense? And so they're ignorant. They're totally under the control of ignorance. Then they use the example of the magician, right? The magician still has the appearance. They cast the spell or whatever, and so they still see the elephant, but they're not. So, I mean, they still have a false appearance of an elephant where there's not an elephant, but they're not afraid of it because they know it's a trick, right? And the point is, that's like the person who's seen emptiness directly but is not yet a Buddha, right? When they're not in meditative equipoise, they see varieties of things, but they still appear to those people as if they're inherently existent, but they don't believe those appearances anymore because they've seen emptiness. Does that make sense? So they're like the magician. But in that story, we don't usually emphasize this, but now is the time where it's being brought up. There's a third person in that story, in that metaphor, the example, whatever. And that's the person who shows up after the spell was cast. So they show up, and what they see is, you can imagine, right? That person doesn't see an elephant. What they see is a magician going, now the great elephant is here, and it will start, be careful, it may trample you. And they see all the people in the audience going, and they know they're all seeing an elephant, right? But from their own side, they don't have a false appearance of an elephant. Does that make sense? And they say that person in the story is like the Buddha. they don't have ignorance to see things falsely. They see whatever. They see the mirrors and the smoke, and they see the people reacting to the mirrors and the smoke as if it's an elephant. But they don't grasp at an elephant, they don't see an elephant, they just see everybody else seeing an elephant. Does that kind of make sense? So I'm just that's the metaphor for this, what he's describing here. Now, he says, now he's giving support. He often does this, right? Remember, Tsongkhapa almost always quotes Indian sources to support his points, because he is not, he's saying, I'm not making this up, and this isn't just some Tibetan trip. This comes from the Buddha and from the great Ind masters. So he quotes Nagarjuna now, 60 stanzas on reasoning. He says, those who are skilled with respect to things see impermanent things, deceptive phenomena, made up, empty, and selfless. They see them as what is referred to as void. In the commentary on this, it says that those who have completed the deeds perceive things in that way. Right? And so he's just saying that, right? That a Buddha who has completed the deeds, meaning completed the 6 perfections, how do they see things? They see them as impermanent. They see them as deceptive to others, not deceptive to themselves, right? And he's clarified that. They see them as made up, as empty, and as selfless, right? So, like the example that I just gave of the elephant, the illusory elephant, right? They see them as made up, as empty, as selfless, as deceptive, and so on. Then he quotes another text, Janana Garba. Oh, actually, I'll read the header here. Although the two truths, their objects are one entity, it is not contradictory to posit individual exalted knowers in relation to them. So now he says, so he's quoting Janana Garba's differentiation of the two truths, which he's going to quote a number of times here. Janana Garba is another Indian master. So he says, omniscient knowers directly perceive all that which arises dependently, devoid of imputed entities. Just this, just as it is, appears. Right? So there he's pointing out, right, the omniscient knower, right, the omniscient mind, or the knower of all aspects, first of all, directly perceive, right, so it's not conceptual, right? Direct perception is a non-conceptual perception. All that which arises dependently. So what are they perceiving? Which is what we were just saying, right? They see dependent origination, right? And dependent arising for them is not deceptive, right? So it's devoid of all imputed entities. It means they're not imputing something, what do we say? Imputing or superimposing, right? They're not superimposing anything on dependent arising. So they see it just as it is, right? It appears only as it is, with no conceptual elaborations, no additions, no projections, no superimposing. They are said to perceive all varieties directly and vividly. Then he quotes further from that same text. When consciousness and objects of knowledge and self are not perceived, since signs do not appear to them, they do not arise, for they firmly abide. And now he explains. What is being explained is that omniscient knowers never arise from the concentration in which dualistic appearances have been completely pacified. So on the one hand, what he's saying is, right, what does he mean by not arise? First of all, ordinary people like us, we never have a direct perception of emptiness, right? But then for somebody who's an Arya Bodhisattva, I've mentioned this before, somebody who's seen emptiness directly, they sometimes enter into the state of meditative equipoise, right? Where all dualistic appearances are pacified. So in other words, they're seeing only emptiness, non-dualistically, like water poured into water, right? And then those bodhisattvas, when they arise from that, again, things appear dualistically for them. They don't believe that appearance. They know it's false because they've seen emptiness directly, but it still appears for them that way. Here he's saying something remarkable, which is he's saying Buddhas never arise from that meditative concentration. Like, so for an ordinary bodhisattva, when they get up and talk to people, they're not in that state anymore. They don't believe in false appearances, but they, like the elephant, right? They're like the person who, what's the word? The magician, right? They see the false appearance, but they don't believe it. But it still appears for them. Does that make sense? He's saying here, a Buddha doesn't have that. A Buddha never arises, even when they're talking to somebody. This is getting at that question I'd asked at Rinpoche. even when they're talking, even when they're teaching, even when they're walking around, or whatever, walking from place to place, they've not, from their own side, they have not arisen from the concentration in which all dualistic appearances have been completely pacified. Now he's going to further explain. He says, to someone who does not understand the modes of both explanations correctly, this may seem contradictory. You can see how that could be. To assert both and not just one of the two, but there is no contradiction. So this, I think, is getting at the question you asked for, right? So he's saying, how can that be, right? He's saying, so somebody who doesn't really understand this, you could think that, right? It would be easy to, wouldn't it? To think, well, how could the person be in a meditative absorption in which they're directly, in which they're directly perceiving emptiness in a completely non-dualistic way with no conceptual elaborations, and at the same time, simultaneously, be perceiving all the varieties, right? And he's saying, the exalted wisdom perceiving suchness and the exalted wisdom perceiving the varieties are one entity. But that does not in the least contradict the fact that in relation to individual objects, it becomes the two, a reasoning consciousness and a conventional consciousness. So this is where he's, I think, addressing the question you were raising, and I don't think in a way that's easy to understand, but that's possible to understand, right? So you see what he's getting at here, though. He's saying, for one point, I want to make a couple points. One point is one point that he's saying, and that all Buddhists are saying, is only a Buddha. This is describing only the state of a Buddha. No other being has this experience, this particular way of being. For all others, there are two different modes that are separate. Does that make sense? They're not one entity. Like, that's what I was saying. Even great bodhisattvas, like on the 10th bhumi or something, they have a mode that's perceiving emptiness directly, like water poured into water with no dualism, and then they have a sense of dualism when they're some kind of dualistic appearance, at least, when they're interacting. But here what he's saying is, and I want to focus on this phrase, this one sentence, the exalted wisdom perceiving suchness and the exalted wisdom perceiving the varieties are one entity. Right? So what we're getting at here, do you remember we had a class where I talked about this before? One entity, but different isolates. I use that phrase, right? And what that means, actually, right, is that one entity means, like, they're not separate phenomena, right? But isolates means you can conceptually recognize the difference, right? Like, and I use that just to get it, I'm going to step back in case people weren't here in that class. So just very simply, I don't want to go too far into it. I don't want to spend a lot of time on this point, but the point there with one entity but different isolates is like, if you look at a person and you say, I'll use the example of Mike, just okay. Like, Mike is one person. He's not multiple people, right? So, but you could isolate conceptually. You could say Mike is a husband. Mike is a father. Mike is a pilot. Mike is a friend. Mike is a, you could go on and on. I mean, we could go on and on, a cousin, and so on, right? We could go on and on, isolating different, what's the word, aspects of Mike, right? But they're not, you can't say the pilot Mike is a separate person from the husband Mike. That would be incorrect. They're one entity, right? But they're different conceptual isolates. That's what we're saying. Does that make sense? So that's the meaning of that. So here we're saying the exalted wisdom perceiving emptiness, suchness, and the exalted wisdom perceiving varieties are one entity. Does that make sense? Just like Mike is one person, that mind of a Buddha is one entity. It's one mind, right? But and actually it's interesting, from the Buddha's own side, now we're getting it back to this point again, right? From the Buddha's own side, it's one entity, it's non-dualistic, right? From our side, if we're going to talk about a Buddha, right, then first of all, we're not Buddhas when we're talking about this, right? And we're talking not from a perspective of ultimate truth, because then we wouldn't be, Buddha could talk from a perspective of ultimate truth, we can't talk from that perspective, right? So when we're talking from a conventional perspective. Does that make sense? And so when we're talking from a conventional perspective, we can say, well, there's one aspect of a Buddha's mind that's the aspect that sees emptiness, and that's completely non-dualistic experience of emptiness, like water poured into water. And there's another aspect of the Buddha's mind that sees all the varieties of things. Does that make sense? And we can talk about those as two aspects. We can conceptualize it that way. And what's interesting is that, of course, from a Buddha's own side, they wouldn't conceptualize it in that way, right? From the Buddha's perspective, they're just one experience. But we can isolate them. That's why, we can isolate those aspects in order to talk about a Buddha's experience. And so what he's saying here, right, so that's where he says, that does not, so now you can see what I mean, what he means actually, right? They're one entity, right? From the Buddha's perspective, they're one thing. They're the Buddha's mind. They're the Buddha's direct experience. But from our perspective, we can isolate them. We can say, well, there's two. There's the reasoning consciousness perceiving the ultimate, right? There's non-dualistic and non-dualistically perceives emptiness. And then we can isolate and say, and there's also the aspect of a Buddha's mind that sees all the varieties of things and so on. And actually, that's also why you can see, like, it's kind of funny. Like, remember earlier I was saying we could like break down the number of bodies of a Buddha. We could say there are 2 or 3 or 4 or 5. We can sort of, because you can conceptually isolate the Buddha in all different ways. Does that make sense? If you want to talk about a Buddha as an ordinary person, and you want to, from a conventional perspective, we can do that, right? But what he's saying here is that doesn't contradict the fact that from a Buddha's perspective, they're all one entity. So I think that's where I think he's addressing the question you were raising.
That helps.
Does that help? Okay, good. Well, and I'll do the next paragraph now because that ends this section, the 15 points. 15 points addressing that one question. So now he says, the outline says, when the two valid cognitions, comprehending objects individually, on the occasion of the view of the bases, or on the occasion of the fruit, you need to know which of the two valid cognitions is active. I want to pause there and just note something, which is important, is Tsongkhapa is saying valid cognitions, right? So he says two valid cognitions, right? And so what he's pointing out, which I think is important, is that there's a valid, because this I think is, this 15 points is getting back to that original one again, and is saying they are valid cognitions. That the valid cognition perceiving ultimate truth, emptiness, is a valid cognition. Does that make sense? It's not something unknowable. That was the initial point, right? And also, the valid cognition perceiving conventionalities is also valid. Does that make sense? It's not some phony, it's not something false. In other words, and that, when you say, that's a chair, that's a valid cognition also. Does that make sense? Okay, so I just wanted to point that out. Now he says, so now getting into the details, he says, this depends on knowing well that there is not the slightest contradiction in there being two different modes of finding objects, by means of the two, a reasoning consciousness and a conventional valid cognition. Reasoning consciousness just is another synonym for, the consciousness perceiving emptiness. Makes sense? So you can see emptiness, or you can see conventional truths. Based on one, and those are based on one phenomena on the occasion of the view of the bases. If you know well, not only that about the occasion of the fruit, when the objects are comprehended by the two exalted wisdoms, but also which of the two valid cognitions is active, then you will also be able to know that they do not become a common locus, even though they do not ascertain their objects separately. Through this, you will also understand the fine details of the definitions of the two truths. And so actually, I just want to share some reflections on this point, right? Because what we have to kind of understand, I think, is that actually, I'm going to go back to Mike for a second, right? I pointed out that you could isolate, right? That Mike is one person, but you could isolate, right? Father, or husband, or pilot, or friend, and so on, right? But I left, well, intentionally, it wasn't relevant now, but now it's relevant. There's another thing about Mike that one could isolate conceptually, which is he's empty. Right? His ultimate nature. Actually, because all those other things, right, that he's a father, a pilot, and so on, husband, a friend, are all valid conventional truths about him as a person, I thing. And then there's another truth about him, which is, which is that he's empty. That he's empty. That his ultimate nature is emptiness. Makes sense. And it's interesting, right? Is that emptiness something? Is Mike's being a father separate from Mike? No. Right? It's not something that exists independent of him somewhere else. It's a quality that's just, what's the word? It's part of his conventional truth nature, said that way. Is Mike's emptiness something separate from Mike? No. Right? It's the ultimate nature of how he exists, right? So it's a characteristic, you could say. It's a characteristic with no characteristics. It's a characteristic of Mike. And so those are all, let's say this right, one entity, right? I'm getting back to the one entity, different isolates. We who are thinking conceptually could conceptually isolate those in different ways, but they're all one entity, right? And it's quite interesting, isn't it? From the conventional side, right? Actually, you could go on and on and on, right? Like you could create, if you wanted to, you could create probably almost endless conceptual elaborations about about Mike or any other, right? He's a person with a beard. He's a person with such and such color hair. He's a person who likes wearing this color shirt. You could keep elaborating different conventional truths if you wanted to. The ultimate truth nature of Mike is just one, emptiness, and they're all one entity. And so part of what he's getting at here, what Lama Tsongkhapa is getting at, is when the Buddha perceives anything, in this case, using Mike as right, he perceives all the different conventional truth aspects, right? And he perceives the ultimate truth aspect. And he perceives them all, in a non-dualistic, direct, non-conceptual way. And then when we, want to talk about, and actually that's what he's getting at, because he says this word basis, and then, right, if you're going to talk about Mike and at the time of the basis, you could say all these different conventional truth statements, and then you could say an ultimate truth statement, right, empty. And then when we look at the mind of a Buddha looking at Mike, if we conceptualize that, we can do the same thing in a way, right? We can say, well, there's the conventional, there's the knower of all aspects that sees all these different varieties of things, and there's the ultimate truth aspect that sees the ultimate nature. And are those, and we can conceptually separate them, but are they actually separate? No. They're of one nature. Right? There's at the basis, Mike's being a father and his being empty is not separate. And from a Buddha's perspective, when the Buddha perceives the conventional truth and the ultimate truth, they're not. They're of one entity. Right? But we could conceptually isolate them. And so what he's getting at here is that if you contemplate that, it helps you understand how the two truths are non-contradictory. Does that make sense? Because before, remember, people misperceive it, right? They think emptiness is unperceivable, or they think emptiness doesn't really exist, or they think emptiness is something separate from the object, something you escape to, or something that's... And what he's saying is, no, emptiness is not a separate entity from conventional truth. Emptiness is the nature of conventional truth, the ultimate nature of conventional truth objects. And they're, this is where you get to that point, right, where Tsongkhapa often will say things like, the meaning of dependent arising is emptiness. The meaning of emptiness is dependent arising. And if you contemplate these points, it helps you understand that. Does that make sense? And that's what he's saying here, I think. Could be a little wrong, but I'm pretty sure.
Mike is in Matrix now.
And we all are. So okay, I'll pause there. Any questions about that before? maybe I'll just make one more comment. You know, and these points, like, you know, whether you think of it here, he's talking about it from the perspective of the Buddha's mind. There are other places where he talks about, you know, dependent arising and emptiness from the perspective of a practitioner. You know, and you could talk about them from the perspective of just how things exist, you know, the basis itself. And the point, I think, is that by contemplating these things from all different perspectives, ultimately we have to come to an understanding of the harmony, or the, yeah, harmony I'll call it, of dependent origination or interdependence and emptiness. That's really the point. You know, because that's the path, right, that where you don't fall into the two extremes. Remember that? In other words, if you keep contemplating that from all these different angles, and he's doing it again here from the perspective of a Buddhist mind, then you won't fall into the extreme of deprecating, right, of nihilism, where you say nothing exists, the emptiness doesn't exist, or the, you know, or if you somehow thought emptiness is the ultimate truth, nature of Mike, and that's the ultimate truth, so all those other things are false, so he's not really, so he's not a pilot, he's not a father, he's not a husband. You know, well, that's not true, actually. That, or is, that would be nihilism, right? Because actually, and it's quite important, isn't it? Both are very important. Whereas the ultimate truth part is really is ultimately important, because if you realize that, you'll achieve liberation from samsara, right? But the conventional truth part is also important, isn't it? Like, you know, like, and the simple example, you know, because if you got in a plane and Mike is flying, you're going to be okay. You know, if you get a plane and I'm flying, you're going to be dead. So it's important to be able to differentiate conventional truths correctly, right? And Chandrakirti says, right, how do you differentiate those? According to the worldly conventions, right? Like, in other words, he has a license to fly, right? And he earned that license for how many hours of flying? I don't know. Many.
Well, technically 40, but I had more than that when I finished.
And now you have thousands, I'm assuming.
No, not quite.
Hundreds.
Yeah.
But anyway, so that's a worldly convention, right? Like, somebody made up that it should be at least 40, right? That's a convention. Somebody made, you know, it's just made up, right? And in a different country, they could decide, or a different time, they could change the rules. They could say now it has to be 80 hours, whatever. Fine. Like, that's what Chandrakirti said. That has to be decided by the world, by worldly conventional discussion. And then whatever the world discusses, right? Like, whether they made that rule 40 hours or 80 or 1,000 hours, doesn't really matter. I mean, that's fine. That matters from a conventional perspective, and it's very important from a conventional perspective. From an ultimate perspective, it's dependently arisen, therefore empty, right? Of inherent existence, right? And if it weren't, actually you can say that, right? And if that status, I'm just using an example of pilot here, but if that weren't empty, then Mike would have been a pilot before he did the first 40 hours, right? He would have been an inherently existent pilot, right? But he's not, right? It came about due to causes and conditions, lessons and study and practice and so on, right? So it's not inherently existent, and therefore it exists, right? Therefore it was able to arise. And it was able to arise, the fact that it was able to arise proves that it's not inherently existent, right? And it's because things aren't inherently existent that they can arise. Does that make sense? And so that's how, like, they're dependent, that which is dependently arisen, its nature, it's not something separate, right? Its nature is emptiness. And you can see it now. That emptiness can be perceived, right? You can get it. Like, of course that can be perceived, right? If you contemplate it and then you analyze, right, what do you call it? Reasoning consciousness, analyzing the ultimate. And then you can see, oh, that's the nature of that thing, right? Anyway, you get the point. Sorry.
Does the Buddha see compassion or feel compassion in a different way? Because that's dependent on how you look at conventional truths, whether you feel compassion or not, I would think, at least for us.
Yeah. Yeah, so one point they say is that a Buddha's always feels, experiences, infinite compassion is one point. So yes. And that, but is it different? I think so. And there's a famous, there's a famous phrase that actually appears in the the Miksema, which is like the mantra or prayer to Lama Tsongkhapa. And the first line of it, the Miksema, it comes from it comes from the first line, which is Ming Mei Tse Wei Ter Che Chen Rei Zi, which is a praise. Each of the lines is the first three lines are praising Tsongkhapa as being Avalokiteshvara, Manjushri, and Vajrapani. But the first line about says Ming Mei Tse Wei Ter Che Chen Rei Zi, they translate it sometimes as like, you are Avalokiteshvara. They sometimes translate great treasure of non-objectifying compassion. Or, yeah, sometimes they talk it that way. But they're talking about the experience of a Buddha there. That a Buddha has compassion for beings without grasping at those beings as inherently existent. Right? Because when we have compassion, an ordinary person has compassion. In other words, it's with a grasping. And actually, they talk about that quite a bit. That it's like, actually, experientially, there are many kinds of. I always love this about Buddhism in general, is that like, I sometimes say that like, I sometimes say and think that, like there's that, it's a cliche now, but there's a cliche that like Eskimos have so many words for snow, right? I mean, now it's a true statement, and it's also a cliche because they live in a place with a lot of snow, and their survival depends on being aware of different kinds of snow coming down and what kinds of snow on the ground and all that. But like, the Indo-Tibetan Buddhist tradition is like that with compassion. They like describe so many different types of compassion and words, phrases and words. Even just the other day, I was like, usually a Tibetan word for compassion is ningje. And then when I was in California, Yume Kensho was saying, well, there's the word tukje, which also means compassion. In English, we just say compassion. And he was like, oh, they're different, though. And then Venerable Steve was translating. He was like, well, we don't have a word. Like, we don't even have words to differentiate. Like, Tibetans have all these different words and phrases for compassion. We don't have the words for them. So how do you differentiate them? Because it's hard to even understand if we don't have, our culture doesn't have, we're not that interested, so we don't think about that. But anyway, one kind of compassion. So there's a kind of there's a compassion grasping at true existence. Like, so that's where like, an ordinary person, right? It's a very positive state of mind, but it's like, I'm thinking about, if I was thinking about your suffering, and then I would have this grasping though, thinking, you're truly existent, inherently existent from your own side. You exist in this kind of separate, independent way, and I find it unbearable that you suffer, right? And that would be a valid compassion. It's real compassion, but that compassion is a compassion grasping at true existence. Then there's a compassion that's still grasping at true existence, but that at least sees impermanence. Does that make sense? Where you have a deep compassion, and you recognize, though, oh wow, like, where it's a different experience of compassion, actually, where you still are grasping at the person as truly existent, and inherently existent. But the person maybe sees themselves as permanent. They don't recognize that everything's changing every instant. But you can recognize everything's changing. And you still have compassion. And part of your compassion includes this recognition, oh wow, like this person's changing every instant, and they don't see that. Actually, and there's a subtle level of that where things are changing every instant, but you don't see it. But like, as ordinary people can have that sometimes, like for somebody who, like for example, I've had that with teenagers sometimes, where like, so let's say a teenager is going through like a breakup or something with their boyfriend or girlfriend or something, and they feel like things will never get better, it's completely hopeless, the world is over, and I might as well be dead kind of feeling. Because they don't recognize, yes, it's painful, but it changes, right? Now that's not subtle impermanence, that's gross impermanence, but I'm old enough that I know things change, right? And so like, so you have compassion, you do recognize this person is really suffering, but you recognize they don't see that it changes, but you know it's going to change. And so maybe you say something like, well, just wait, and, get a good night's sleep tonight, and it'll be better, and something, whatever. You try to sort of impart that in some way, but it's impermanent, but they don't know it's impermanent in that moment. Does that make sense? And then there's a kind of bodhisattva where they have that towards all beings, like that they see it in a subtle, I'm using an extreme example of the teenager after breakup, but we all do that to some extent, right? We feel, freaked out about things because we feel, and I can so many times I think back and I'm like, wow, I was so freaked out by that. Now it's like a dream. It's totally over. But it seemed so concrete to me at the time. And if I had had this perspective then, I just would have been more calm at least. Something like that, right? So that's still grasping at true existence, but it's with an understanding of impermanence, a compassion like that for somebody else. I use the example of the teenager, but you get it. And then there's another kind. Now I'm getting it to the one that I mentioned that. They call it non-objectifying compassion. compassion or something like that. That's where in this case they're talking about Avalokiteshvara and Tsongkhapa, but where they have a compassion that recognizes that, first of all, the person who they have compassion for is suffering, and that person is empty of inherent existence, and they also know that person, kind of like what we're talking about here, the Buddha knows that that person doesn't know they're empty of inherent existence, and therefore they're suffering because of that lack of knowledge. They're having self-grasping, and their self-grasping is giving rise to all kinds of suffering. And so the Buddha knows that all of that. It's kind of like what we're talking about here, right? So the Buddha knows they're suffering, they have self-grasping, they don't even know that they have self-grasping, and therefore that compounds their suffering. And the Buddha knows they actually don't inherently exist, but they don't know they don't inherently exist. And that's a very unique kind of compassion that only enlightened beings have. But so that's the kind that describes the kind of a Buddha's compassion, which. Yeah, so the Buddha always has that kind of compassion for sentient beings, is the idea. So does that make sense, kind of? So it's a kind of special, and yeah, I just love that though. That there are all these different types. You could spend like a lot of time just talking about the different types of compassion. So that's what you're getting at, is the compassion that enlightened beings have. But then also for ordinary beings, right? There's like, let's point that out. Like there's the compassion. There's so many types, right? There's the compassion where you just wish beings were free from suffering, but you don't. In the four immeasurables, right? There are four different, for each of the four immeasurables. So for compassion, there are four types, right? There's the one where it's like how wonderful it would be, right? Then there's the one where it's like may they be, where it's stronger, right? It's not just it'd be great if you were free from suffering. It's like may you be. You're starting to feel a stronger sense. Then there's I'll free you from your suffering. I myself take the responsibility. That's totally different, right? And then there's the one of like, where you're praying to the Buddha's bless me to be able to do that, and I'm going to do the practices to do that. Not just I'll do it, but I'm going to do it now. And I'm going to actually take action. Those are all, I'm just pointing out, those are more levels of types of compassion. So there's so many different types of compassion. Then there's compassion for an individual. There's compassion that embraces all beings, right? There's compassion that has equanimity with it. It's not just for certain beings or something. So there are many, many types, which I think is just, how cool is that, right? Just because it's like, wow, if you're interested in something, then you start to notice all the details about it. And if you're not interested in compassion, then you don't even think about that. You just say, you might just go, oh yeah, I want to be a nice person, and then that's all you do. But if you really start thinking about compassion deeply, then you get to the questions you're raising. Well, what's the compassion of a Buddha like? What's the compassion of a Bodhisattva like? What's the compassion like if you recognize impermanence? It's different. Does that make sense? The quality of the experience of compassion for that person is different than the person who doesn't understand impermanence and so on.
Yeah, something came to my mind, Dr. Lala. These days, like it's been a year or two, very recently, His Holiness now, whenever he's inviting stuff, he's inviting, formless beings as well.
Right.
Why not?
Yeah.
Let me invite that too. I find that very interesting in a sense.
Well,
That's where the compassion probably party of.
yeah, more vast compassion. Yeah, there's a tradition like that, like where sometimes they'll say, there's like, I can't remember the exact, like where sometimes a Lama will have like a phrase and they'll sort of do a gesture of teaching and they'll invite all the, there are people there, but then they're inviting all the different kinds of
Usually it's not
spirits.
done unless you have the power to do so, I guess.
Yeah, they say though sometimes, actually I'm just remembering that, they say sometimes like if you're, I don't know if it works or not externally, but they say sometimes if you're doing like, if you're reading a sutra or something, that you create more good karma if you think that way at least. Like, so if you think, like if you're going to read the Sutra of Golden Light, for example, or something, or the Vajracutter Sutra, they say it's actually quite good if you think that way. If you think, I'm inviting all sentient beings, and, like the invisible beings I can't see, or any beings, whatever, I'm inviting you all to listen, because this isn't, not because of my power, but because of the power of the sutra itself. And then you recite the sutra, that you create more good karma. I guess it depends on, I don't know if the beings actually come or not, but just inviting them and sort of wishing that, it makes your mind, it makes your compassion more broad, doesn't it? For us also. So it's good to even wish that or something. But I guess it's different with someone like this, when they have the actual power to benefit those beings more directly. But okay, so we should probably. So we'll do the dedication. The Supreme Jewel Bodhicitta, what has not arisen, may it arise and grow. What has arisen, may it not decrease, but increase more and more. In this snowy mountain paradise, you the source of good and happiness, all-powerful Chenrezig Tenzin Gyatso, please remain until samsara ends. Oh, and let's also dedicate, we started with the motivation, so let's also dedicate, I had mentioned that at the beginning that our friend and who usually is in class, Lisa, Richard's partner, David, died. So we can also dedicate the merit, first of all for him, so that he, in his journey in the in-between, Bardo, may realize the nature of his own mind, may have a good rebirth to continue his own, practice of path, of compassion, and also for her, that she may have healing,